Now we could begin to discuss reconstruction and the various phases which describes the unfolding of reconstruction. Now, just to let you know that reconstruction actually begins before the end of the war itself. Okay, the war ends in 1865 with the Treaty of Appomattox, but even before the treaty, you see the federal government began to devise policies pertaining to reconstructing the South. And therefore, you have wartime reconstruction. But then you have two other phases, presidential and congressional. And the year that historians like to mark the end, the official end of Reconstruction, is 1877. And we'll get into the reasons as to why that particular year is important later on in this lecture topic. But for now, it extends from, let's say, before the end of the war until 1877. That's the official Reconstruction era of our country. Okay. Now, as I just mentioned, you see federal planners even before the treaty ends the war. Why? Because, Southern defeat seems imminent now. It seems to be the handwriting on the wall, so to say. So you see various leaders starting to think about what should be the conditions of readmission to the Union. Now, when it comes to Lincoln, he's, of course, in the executive branch. And he firmly believes, therefore, that it is the executive branch of government that should be in control of Reconstruction, more so than that of Congress. Okay, so that's Lincoln's firm belief that, in particular, himself, right? He's going to be in charge of devising policy and enacting that policy. So this is wartime reconstruction. Now let's recall that Lincoln never sees the conflict as, a moral struggle. He always thinks politically. And again, this is not to say that Lincoln had no moral reservations against slavery, but, first and foremost in his mind is politics. Politics is shaping or governing his every move when he's president. He sees secession itself and the war as a political issue, and he never recognizes the fact that the 11 Confederate states that secede, one after the other, right, in 1860, 1861, he sees that as unconstitutional. Let me remind you that. So, therefore, he never sees them as this sort of sovereign nation. He never recognizes their independence. And therefore, he never sees the war itself as a war between two separate nations. And by the way, this is opposed again by the more radical factions in the Republican Party that definitely see this as a war between two separate nations. Okay, so due to Lincoln's stance, that is to say, his view of it being a political struggle, he his policy abides by what we call the logic of reconciliation. Okay, that is to say that he will be very mild in the conditions for readmission. Um, he will put national healing, if you will, before issues of black justice, right? He will see this as a family struggle, right? And therefore, in order to reconcile and heal the nation, you should make the conditions very mild. That's how he's thinking, right? Make the conditions mild. And this is perfectly encapsulated in a famous slogan of his, actually. You may have heard of this slogan. And it goes like this, quote, malice towards none, charity towards all, unquote. So let's not be too malicious, if you will, right? Let's not let malice guide these conditions of readmission. as believed by Lincoln. Rather, let's be charitable. Let's be accommodationist. Let's be, again, conciliatory, right? When we think about Reconstruction. And it's perfectly reflected again in Lincoln's plan. And this is called, again, this is happening before surrender, Lincoln's 10% plan. And if you take a look there, he only requires 10% of eligible voters to take an oath of allegiance to renounce secession before going back into the fold of the Union. Right now, this is very mild, to say the least. Only 10% of eligible voters have to renounce secession and take an oath of allegiance towards the Union, the United States of America, before they could begin to, come up with more concrete policies in terms of readmission. And, it's a complicated process in itself, that is to say. You have to re think the state constitutions, right? You have to think about the status of ex-slaves, which we discussed. So it's very complicated, but the first steps for readmission is very mild when you're only requiring 10%. Now, because of the logic of reconciliation that Lincoln abided by, and it was especially very mild, very conciliatory, he was greeted with scorn and criticism even by his colleagues, right? The so-called moderate Republicans, let alone the radical Republicans who felt that the war was all about black justice. And therefore, Reconstruction should put first and foremost the issue of black freedom, black justice, and the definition of the parameters of what should constitute black freedom, right? Okay, so we see the response to Lincoln's 10% plan with the Wade Davis bill. Now, both Wade and Davis are actually radical Republicans. And what they did in response to Lincoln's very mild plan is to require not just 10%, but 50% of eligible voters in any particular southern state that seceded. 50% of the voters have to renounce secession, and then they can begin the steps towards readmission, right? Like rewriting the Constitution and thinking about black freedom. Okay, so 50% is significantly more or a higher number, right, than 10%. And moreover, the Wade Davis bill required that no ex-Confederate can actually be elected to any office within the newly admitted state, right, or readmitted southern state. And even further, they required that some kind of policy had to be planned in terms of black freedom, okay, freedom for ex-slaves. So notice they're putting that in there, that the issue of the freedom of ex-slaves and black justice, right? Okay, again, when you look at Lincoln's 10% plan, it's glaringly obvious that there's nothing reflected in his plan in terms of black justice, black freedom. And this is why you see the radical Republicans really upset with Lincoln's 10% plan, because they really believed, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation, that this was indeed a moral crusade to eradicate slavery. And also, the corollary of this is to promote black justice. Okay, so the Wade Davis bill was a counter to Lincoln's 10% plan. Okay, so again, let's get back to the theme of the meaning of the war. Even at the first phase of wartime Reconstruction, we see how Lincoln's 10% plan is guided by or governed by his interpretation of the war, his meaning of what the war was, right? He saw the war as a family struggle, if you will, and therefore he should be very conciliatory, and that guides his 10% plan. Okay, now I keep discussing the radical Republicans, so here we have to acknowledge two factions within the Republican Party. Now, if you took colonial history to the Civil War, if you took that course, then you probably learned that the Republican Party has its origins as a party, a political party, not to eradicate slavery wherever it existed. That was not on the agenda of the radical Republicans. Rather, or excuse me, of the Republican Party itself. Rather, the Republican Party emerged to um, object to the spread of slavery into the Western territories because we had gained so much territory from what's called the U.S. Mexico War, and a big argument erupted by the end of the 1840s and into the 1850s as to whether slavery should be extended into that area. So the Republican Party has its origins with against the extension of slavery, but not necessarily the end of slavery, the immediate end. Now, by the time the war broke out, you see the Republican Party breaking into factions in terms of their viewpoint revolving around slavery. Now, the moderate Republicans, and by the way, Lincoln considered himself as a moderate, they believed in something you could call gradualism. Okay. And basically, the approach was to take gradual steps in defining uh, what should be the parameters again, the contours of Black freedom. And again, what are some examples of Black freedom? You know, should they become citizens, for example? Should they be given the right to vote? Should they be given the right to run for office? Should they be given the right to sell their labor as as an employee in return for a wage? Should they be given the right to own land? So these are pressing issues, right? That are not even or defined yet. It's ill defined. It's in the embryonic stages of discussion. Now, if you're a moderate, you believe that all these freedoms that you define as Black freedoms should not be thrust upon African American community overnight, so to speak. Rather, you should take it step by step. You should be gradual. You should be incremental in your approach towards the granting of Black freedoms. Okay, they believe this was the best way to deal with the problem of integration of former slaves, right? To take it step by step. Now, this is opposed to the radical Republicans. And by the way, when it comes to the whole Republican Party itself, the radicals were the minority factions. More Republicans at this time were moderates. And again, that includes Lincoln himself. So if you're a radical Republican, you disagreed and repudiated gradualism. Rather, you felt that due to the fact that the war itself was all about Black justice, okay, not only eradicating slavery, but Black justice, the kinds that I just enumerated to you. Well, you insisted, you demanded that these political freedoms, these rights should be conferred upon African Americans immediately. Okay, you demanded immediate political rights for these freed persons. There's no need to take a gradual approach because why? African Americans are citizens too, uh, you know, due to Northern victory, right, and the vanquishing of the Southern states, the Confederate states. So therefore, this war pivoted on that particular issue itself, right? The eruption of war pivoted on the issue of black freedom, and therefore radicals believed it should be immediately granted. So that's the distinction between moderate Republicans, who again were the majority, versus the more minority radical Republicans. And as you could probably imagine, when we go through the phase of radical reconstructions, we're going to see who's in charge now. It'll be the radicals, right? But this is a little later on. First, we're going to see something that happens called presidential reconstruction, the second phase. All right, so now we're going to move on to the next video.